Once I complete the reconstruction of the glass urn, I then started thinking about making the fills for the missing areas on the object. And for this, I decided to use two different techniques. One of them is molding and casting, which you can see some of the previously made molds from another object. I'm using dental wax. You can actually put it in hot water or gently heat it with a hot air blower to mold it into any shape you want. I use a lap seal to actually cover the edges of the glass so that the fill material like plaster or any other material does not go over the original surface of the object. I use several tools, conservation tools, and also plaster, which I will be making my gap fills from. Before making the detachable plaster fills, before molding it, I use the dental wax first. So I take a mold from the similar area on the neck of the urn, and then once it sets, once the wax cools down, I place the wax inside the glass to actually make like a backing. But beforehand, the lap seal, I use it as a barrier to cover the edges of the area that I will be filling. To make a plaster fill, I have this little bowl and I fill it with a little bit of water. And then I start adding plaster. And for this, I will need to use quite a lot of plaster until I can create a kind of a paste. So once the plaster is in this kind of consistency, as you can see, it's quite like a putty-like. So it's a bit like cooking, really. And then I start applying the plaster with my spatula onto the gap that I backed. I supported with dental wax and the lap seal. Plaster sets very quickly, therefore I need to do this work quite quickly too. You have to put the plaster in layers. And in this case, you can see the gap here is quite large, but I decided to do it in two bits because if I fill this in one go, there's a risk that once the plaster is set, it may break. So I decided that I will do it in two parts. And it is very easy to work with plaster when it's still wet or damp. But once it starts setting, it gets a bit difficult, so you have to be quite quick. Once I make the fill, I then leave it for until tomorrow for it to completely dry and set before I can actually remove the fill from the object. After that, although the fill is made, there will be still lots of irregularities and some, scratches and some kind of application tool marks on it. As you can see in this case here, or I have another example, I've already made one and started working on the surface by smoothing it with several sandpapers. I actually wet the plaster fill, the surface of the plaster fill, and then with different grades of sandpapers, I start correcting or smoothing all the irregularities, scratch marks, tool marks, etc. I then use a conservation grade like a putty, a bit like polyfiller, but this is like conservation tested, to fill in any kind of holes or gaps, anything like that, because remember, my aim is to make a perfect surface. And once that's done, and once I decide that my fill is ready, I can actually start with the mold making process and then taking a mold and then following, make a cast of it by using epoxy resin.